I'm building a 2-trailer tiny house and it's time for a build update. And I think you're going to adore this one. Don't knock my jokes, there might be an opening to something. I'm just over halfway through making these doors and I thought it a great opportunity to walk you through how I'm putting these things together, why they've become so complex, and in the next video we can actually have a look at what they look like and how they go into the house. So I had this dream of creating a door that's like super minimal, solid pane of glass on the outside and the brass and timber on the inside. It'd be completely weatherproof and it would sort of match the style of my windows, which I was gonna look really cool. But when I got to doing them, oh man, have I overcooked these things? There's just so much work that goes into them and I didn't quite anticipate how complex they're going to be. So there's a couple reasons these things are so complicated. I'm capping them in brass, which means I have 16 pieces of brass that I have to individually cut, hand polish, and because they're joining with miters, I need to make sure I get these things within a fraction of a millimeter, because a millimeter gap when you're doing a miter joint is a huge gap. So I have to cut each piece. But then because the door is capped in brass, I need to cut it in around the door hardware. So I need to cut around the latches and the hinges, and I have 16 pieces of brass. I have to cut 10 of those, which means hand cutting slits or notches and then filing them down to the just right, which has just been such tedious work. But then the other problem I've got is because I'm capping this in brass, I can't trim the door. So when I put it into place, these doors have to be perfect. And because I'm lining up two doors, the doors have to be exactly the same. They have to line up perfectly. And because they're meeting in the middle and I've got a latch that goes between them, they need to line up perfectly so those latches actually match. So I need to make sure the doors are square, they're the same size, line up perfectly when I finally put the brass on the outside. And then when I come to fitting them into the door jamb, any imperfections I get in sizing, I have to compensate for in the door jamb. So I just have really made these things a bit harder than they need to be. But I love how they're coming together. These things with the brass on the timber and then the glass and the black band are seriously starting to look good. I really love how they're looking, and they're gonna be one of a kind. And I know that for sure because I'll never do them again. So the design of these doors is actually pretty simple. It's just the execution of them that's so complicated. So what I've done is on the inside here, I've just done a post and rail door. So we've got two posts up the side here and my rails along the bottom. Now, because I only see one side of the timber and I don't care what the other side looks like, I was just able to do a simple lap joint in the corner here, which is much easier to do than a mortise joint, but also gives me a nice, strong gluing area to join these together. So to get started, I had to machine up all of the timber. What I had to do was to make sure that the thickness of this timber, plus the glass, plus the adhesive bed, less the thickness of my brass inlay, added up to exactly 2 pieces of brass angle. So on the outside it's 38 mil, on the inside it's just under 35 mil. So when the brass sat down in this inlay, the distance between here, the other side of here, needed to be just under 35 millimeters. So I machined the timber up and then I rebaited for my brass inlay on the inside of my door, which is the reveal, and then did the rebates for the brass on the outside of the door, which is my capping. Once all the timber was machined, I then cut the half lap joints into the ends of my timber, which proved pretty difficult to do because all I've got is like a job site saw and a table sled. And because these things are 2 meters long, it was a pain in the butt to try and support them as I cut out that lap joint. Once it was all cut out, I then glued up both the doors, trying to get them as square and the same size as possible. So with the doors all made up, I then gave these things a full sand because once I start putting the brass in, I can't really sand them much. So I sanded them off, got them nice and smooth, make sure my joints are looking good. Once I'd done that, I then did the brass inlay on the inside of my door. So much like my windows, I've got a brass inlay running around on the inside, which looks awesome because it's actually this like band of brass and timber that runs around the inside of my door. And that also gives me my band of brass and I'm actually sticking the glass down to. So much like the windows, I'm putting the adhesive onto the brass and not onto the timber. And that means if I ever need to replace a piece of glass, I'm only scraping that adhesive off of the brass. Because remember, this stuff is silicone based, which means I need to remove it all before I can put adhesive adhesive back over the top of it. With that done, I then had to fine tune the doors. So even as careful as I was with the gluing process, these things were marginally out by, like a millimeter or so. So what I needed to do was to put the two doors side by side, line them up, make sure that all the posts are going to be parallel, and then fine tune the rails to make sure that they're exactly the same height when I put brass on it, and that they're nice and straight. And once I'd done that, when I put brass on the outside, the tops and the bottoms of the door lined up perfectly. The last thing I needed to do before I stuck my glass on was to cut in all my door hardware. So on this door here, I actually had the holes pre-cut into the glass. So what I needed to do was to line up that glass perfectly where it was going to go on the door, and then mark the holes on this rail here and cut them in. Once I'd done that, I could then cut in the holes for my latches. Now that was slightly problematic because I only just have enough room. So when you cut a latch into the side of the door, you take out quite a bit of the door. And that meant I was actually cutting out to where the glass has got to go. Now, luckily with the thickness of the adhesive, I could cut my 25mm hole here and I get a few mil clearance behind the back of my glass. So the latches just fit in. So because these are double doors, I need to install these flush bolts. Now, these bolts lock this door into place and the other door swings around and latches into the side of this door. Now, that was problematic because unlike on a normal door where I just cut a rebate and install this, I didn't have half the door. So I had to install this, sort of cut out around the timber and make sure I got it in just the right spot. It's going to be nice and secure to hold the door. Didn't infringe on the glass when I put that on, but also because I'm doing brass capping, making sure I got it exactly the right spot so that when I put it in, it's nice and even between the capping, but also nice and flush so it looks $1 million when the brass goes in around here and you got the bolt sitting in the middle. So the last thing I needed to do was to cut in the door hinges. So the challenge I had was to put in these door hinges. I needed to rebate into the door. The problem is my door's capped in brass. Now, if I'd stuck the hinge on the outside here, I would have ended up with a really large gap between the door and my jamb. Now, the other problem I have is on my jamb, I can't recess the hinge either because it's going to be going straight onto Colorbond. So I can't rebate the hinge into the jamb, which means I need to have the thickness of this hinge in between the jamb and the door. So if I just put the door on the face of it, I end up with a huge gap that was just too much. So I need to rebate in. Problem is, if I rebated into the brass like this, I had to cut out so much of the brass and ended up with this very narrow strip along here that was all that was holding this piece of brass together. Now that was a problem not only for me gluing it on, but this is all designed, if I have to replace a piece of glass, I can just cut the silicone around here and these brass like trimmings all lift off, except for these, which will just be a little bit different. So what I just ended up doing was cutting a slit into the brass here that goes down through the brass trimming and then it is rebated into the timber of the door. And that, oh man, was just a fiddly, tedious job. I had to carefully mark them out, cut them out with the grinder and then hand file it, which was just days of filing. But that then meant that the hinges go down through the brass. It also helped take up some of that gap that I had between my door jamb and the door, because now not only do I have the hinge rebated into the door, but I also have the thickness of this brass between it, which means I ended up with about a 3.5mm gap between the edge of my door and door jamb, which is just spot on. Then once I had the brass cut, I needed to do that first because that sets where my hinges are going to be on the door, and that needed to be spot on. So once I'd done that, I could then mark where the rebates are going to go on the door. I cut out the rebates and then could screw the hinges in. Then it also means now, because the hinges are in behind the brass, no water can get in there, the screws are completely hidden, and I get this super seamless finish around the hinge. And then the last thing I've done is put these rare earth magnets into the top of both the doors. Now these are actually going to activate sensors so I can tell when either of the doors are open on the house. The next step was to attach the glass onto the doors. Now this is largely the same process as the windows, but what I did to mask up this band on the outside was actually line up the glass perfectly with the timber frame. So I actually used the hinges as a reference point and put a stopper on the end so I knew it was going to be in exactly the same spot when I stick it down. So I put the glass down and then flipped the timber over and put it on the same spot, lining it up. Then what I did was to run my masking tape on the inside of the door so that I knew that this adhesive would line up perfectly with the edge of the brass. Then it was the same process. I prepped the brass, I sanded it back, did the primer, put my glazing foam in, and then ran my glazing bead around there. And then I did my band of adhesive onto the glass. Now this was problematic because this was much wider than what I did on the windows, which meant I had a larger surface area that was going off faster, but also took so much more time to smooth that out and get that nice solid black band. So I had to work so fast, and I was really pushing the limits of how fast this adhesive was skinning off. It came out really well. I didn't get any air bubbles, except I got a couple lines in the adhesive, and I don't know what happened there. It kind of looks like there's a scratch in the glass, but you know, if you stand back and squint it looks pretty good. So we'll just deal with that. So once I had that on, I then brought it around, I flipped it over, putting it up against the hinges and against that end stop, and then laid it down on top of the timber frame. Now, once I'd done that, I had to get the glass and the timber at exactly the right thickness. So I went around with a pair of veneer calipers and some wedges, moving the glass up and down to get it at exactly 34.75 millimeters, so it was just right. And yes, I'm serious, because it's exactly 35 mil on the inside of this glass, and I wanted 0.2, 0.3 of a millimeter for my bed of silicone that's gonna go between the brass and the glass here. So I worked around the door, putting wedges in at every 300 mil, getting it exactly the right thickness. So with the glass attached and cured, I can now start putting the brass on, which is the last step to do before I actually just put the door latches in. So much like my windows, the inside pieces, I've used a polyurethane to stick these into place. So I'm sticking the inside pieces on first, and these inside pieces should never come off. So I need them just stuck down well and not be able to remove. Now the outside pieces are a little bit different, because just in case I ever need to replace a piece of glass, I need to be able to safely remove these pieces of brass on the outside here. So what I've done is I've used a glazing silicone where I've run a bed of silicone along the top edge here, so I get a nice seal against the brass and the glass. And then on the edges here, I've run a thin bead along the base here to seal between those two pieces of brass here and hold that back edge in, but it doesn't need to be held in as strong. Then what I've done is let that set, extra silicone pushed out of this edge here, and then I've run a razor blade along here, scraped off the extra silicone and cleaned it up with alcohol. So I get a nice seal against this brass, so I don't have water that's running down the glass going in behind the brass. But also if it ever needs to be removed, you can run a razor blade along there, lift off that brass, and then because this large face isn't being held on, it's only been held on the edge, you should be able to just roll it out and take those outside three pieces off. Now this one's a little bit different. What I need to do is to break this seal along here, but it's on the hinges. So it should be able to just slide up on those hinges so that you can get the piece of glass out. So that's the doors so far. I love how these things are coming out. I can't wait to show you what they look like when they're finished. The next steps is I need to finish the brass capping on here. So this door is pretty much done except for the latch side, and then I've got to do all the brass on this one, and then I can install my lock hardware. Now the one problem I have is I'm still waiting on my deadbolt to arrive, so I can't actually finish the brass on the latch side of both of these doors because I need to be able to cut out around that latch when it comes. So once I have that, I can then finish the brass on these doors. In the meantime, I'll probably move my mind to the door jamb, and that's going to take quite a bit of work. So I can line up these two doors, work out how big the jamb needs to be, and then I need to fiddle with the jamb because I can't trim these things at all. So any movement or alignment I need to get to these doors, I need to do through the door jamb. So once I've got the brass done on these doors, I'm going to move on to that jamb, get that set up, and hopefully by the time that finishes, the cladding shouldn't be far away and we can actually get this house a lock up, which would be awesome. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Don't hate, educate, comment down below if you see something in this video that can be improved. If you have any questions about how I've gone about these doors, I don't recommend you do them. They're just not worth it. I mean, look, I love how they're coming up, and I am pretty excited to show you guys just how good these things look when they're finished. I have a feeling they're going to look $1 million. Meantime, I've got heaps of work to do to get these things done. So go build cool stuff, and I'll see you guys soon.